Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason DeCosta, and thank you for joining me today on my show called Consistent Preterism. Today I just wanted to talk briefly about the no condemnation concept and idea in the scriptures. Now, in the book of Romans in chapter 8, in verse 1, we read, "There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life is in Christ Jesus has made me free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh on account of sin." So the entire portion here in Romans 7 leading into Romans 8 is Paul speaking about the law, right? I mean, nobody's going to deny that. In fact, in Romans 7, he begins the chapter by saying, "Now I speak to those of you who know the law," obviously because he had a pagan Gentile and also a law-practicing audience here in Rome. And so he's sort of addressing it to those who know the law, those who were practicing the law, those of the circumcision. And he goes through and he explains that the law was weak and it couldn't perfect, and it was, all this stuff, and it brought death and everything. And then in Romans 8 verse 1, he says, "There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus." Now, for those of you who know where I'm going with this, you may know that I'm going over to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, where Paul speaks in verse 7 forward of the glory of the new covenant. Let's read it. It says in verse 7 of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, "But if the ministry of death, written and engraved on stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of the glory of his countenance, which glory was passing away, how will the ministry of the Spirit not be more glorious?" So what does he call the law? He calls it the ministry of death. Okay, now, do you believe that that has any relation to what happened to Adam in the garden when Adam experienced death? I believe it does. I do not think there is multiple deaths and multiple stories going on here. I think that whatever happened to Adam in the garden is exactly what happened to Israel by way of the Mosaic law. They experienced death from it, okay? He says in verse 7, "But if the ministry of death, written and engraved on stones," that's the law, "was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of the glory of his countenance, which glory was passing away, how will the ministry of the Spirit not be more glorious?" Now, check this out. Verse 9, he says, "For if the ministry of condemnation had glory, the ministry of righteousness exceeds much more in glory." So what does Paul now call the law? He calls it the ministry of condemnation. Okay, so he says, if he first calls it the ministry of death, written and engraved on stones, we know it's the law, the old covenant. And then he calls it the ministry of condemnation. And he says, well, if that ministry of condemnation in its weak state had some glory, then imagine how much glory the ministry of righteousness has. All right, but remember now, Paul is calling the law the ministry of condemnation. And remember in Romans 8 verse 1, he says, "There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ." So if the law was the ministry of condemnation, and if there was therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ, then who were those in Christ? Only those under the law. You see how that works. The law is what brought condemnation. Christ came to remove that condemnation from those under the law. There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ. Meaning that you couldn't be in Christ unless you were first under the law. You couldn't be in Christ unless you were condemned. And the law was the ministry of condemnation. All right, and then Paul in 2 Corinthians 3 verse 10 says, "For even what was made glorious had no glory in this respect because of the glory that excels. For if what is passing away was glorious, what remains is much more glorious." Okay, then he says, "Therefore, since we have such hope, we use great boldness of speech, unlike Moses, who put a veil over his face so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the end of what was passing away, but their minds were blinded. For until this day, the same veil remains unlifted in the reading of the Old Testament because the veil is taken away in Christ. But even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil lies on their heart. Nevertheless, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord." So you might be asking, when in verse 15 it says, but even to this day when Moses is read, a veil lies on their heart. Well, again, we have to remember that Paul is many times making the comparison between Jew and Gentile, but not outside of the confines of the children of Israel, not outside of the confines of the elect. So when he says a veil lies on their heart, he's speaking of the Jews who were Israel in that day. All right, that's another tricky part that I don't think people understand. The Jews of that day, those living in Judea, those living in the nation, were called Israel. Okay, by all other nations, they were called Israel. That's why, like, when Paul is speaking to the elect of the dispersion in Rome, he says, my heart's desire is that all Israel would be saved. He's speaking of those in the nation of Israel, right, as he's gathering these elect ones back in. But we have to be careful, because sometimes when the term Israel is used, it's being used speaking of those in the nation at that time, the Jews. Okay, it's tricky. We have to be very cautious. But the point that I wanted to get at here is on the condemnation of that old covenant. All right, the old covenant brought the death. Okay, the old covenant brought the condemnation, and that was the law. All right, it was those under the law. So in order for Christ to be the end of condemnation, or in order for there to not be any condemnation, therefore, for those in Christ, you would first have to be qualified by being under the law. All right, and then there's another portion that I want you to look at here in Romans 5, right? I think it's Romans 5:16, which says, and the gift is not like that which came through the one who sinned. Speaking of Adam, for the judgment which came from one offense resulted in what? Condemnation. Condemnation. Okay, now, what did I just read to you from 2 Corinthians chapter 3? Paul calls the law what? Paul calls the old covenant what? The ministry of condemnation. All right, and look what Paul says in Romans 5:16 about Adam. He says, and the gift is not like that which came through the one man who sinned, speaking of Adam. For the judgment which came from that one offense of Adam resulted in condemnation. So if the law and the tablets written on stone and God's law was the ministry of condemnation, according to Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and if Paul says that the judgment which came from Adam's offense resulted in condemnation in Romans 5, then do you think Adam had the law and broke it? I believe that is the case. Okay, it sort of makes more sense of Hosea 6:7, where the prophet compares Israel to Adam. And he says they, speaking of Israel, like Adam, transgressed the covenant. They, Israel, just like Adam, transgressed the covenant. So you have the picture of Adam being in the garden, transgressing the covenant, whatever that was, violating the law. The result was condemnation. He got kicked out of the garden. He got pushed out. He got almost dispersed. Who knows what really happened? You have a very, vague description of it back there. But the common factors are Adam transgressed the covenant, just like Israel. He was kicked out of the garden. Okay, and when you see Israel in places like Ezekiel pictured as transgressing the covenant, what happened to them? They were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, which the prophets referred to as Jerusalem. Ezekiel calls Jerusalem the Garden of Eden, the Garden of God, those two names. So it's just interesting how they both transgress the covenant. They both get kicked out of the promised land. Okay, they both get kicked out of the garden. So anyways, let me see if I wanted to tie in any other passages here. Let's go back to Romans 5. Again, it says, death spread to all men because of Adam's one sin. Well, again, what was the ministry of death? It was the law. Okay, and then Paul counters immediately after that, says, for until the law, sin was in the world, but sin was not imputed where there was no law. So do you get the point? Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is saying, hey, the law is the ministry of death. It's what brings death. All right, and then when we go to Romans 5, he says, one man brought sin into the world and death through sin. And then the next thing Paul says is, for until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there is no law. All right, now, this is Paul basically saying that the ministry of death began at Adam, meaning the law began at Adam. He was the first man in covenant, first man under the law. And I know some of you may not like that, some of you may disagree, but this is all I'm seeing. Okay, you cannot say that the law began at Moses. Okay, you can't do it. Genesis chapter 26 flat out says that Abraham was counted by God to be righteous, whatever the case may be. And the reason was, quote unquote, because he observed his laws and his commandments. Or he gave Abraham his laws and commandments, and Abraham observed them. So flat out in the text in Genesis 26, the idea that the law was first initiated at Moses is shot dead in the water. And of course, we know it goes back to Noah with his sacrifices, clean, unclean animals coming on the ark, the altar. Then it goes all the way back to Cain and Abel with their clean and unclean sacrifices and sacrificing on the altar. So the law was always there. This was the ministry of death. Okay, and it began in the garden. And as you proceed through the story, it grows and grows and grows until the Mosaic law, which made sin exceedingly sinful. Okay, because it was a bunch more laws. All right. But again, I just wanted to take a little time to talk about that. I thought it was kind of interesting how the promise that Christ gave was that there would be no condemnation for those in him. And yet Paul explains where the condemnation came from, that being the Old Covenant law. Which again shows my point that you were not eligible for salvation unless you were under the law and under the condemnation of the Old Covenant to begin with. Which is why Paul says in Galatians 4:5 that he was born into the law to redeem those under the law. And which is why Paul also says that he is the end of the law to those who believe. Anyways, I know this was short. I hope you enjoyed it. Didn't want to bog you down with too much today. I thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. We'll be back another day, another time, another place, and another rhyme. Bye-bye, everybody.